Today, we are talking about one of the most important poets of the 20th century, Allen Ginsberg. You probably know him as a counterculture icon, a giant of the Beat generation, but as it turns out, he was also a person of serious interest to the US government.
Just listen to this. This is the official take on Allen Ginsberg from an FBI document back in 1965. Antipathy toward good order in government. I mean, that's not what you typically hear about a poet, right? It makes him sound like a dangerous, subversive character.
And that really gets to the heart of the matter here. How does a writer, someone who literally just works with words and ideas, end up being seen as a threat to national security? To figure that out, well, we have to open up his government file.
So our story doesn't start in some smoky coffee shop or at a poetry slam. Nope. It begins deep inside the filing cabinets of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
And this wasn't just some passing curiosity. It started small, with a simple name check in '63. But by 1965, the New York field office had opened a full-blown investigation. For years, they were watching him, gathering info, building a case.
So, what kicked it all off? What turned a passing glance into a formal file? A trip to Cuba. Yeah, in 1965, Ginsberg got an invitation to go judge a literary contest. To the FBI, that was enough to start looking into whether he was involved in activities, and, I'm quoting here, inimical to the interests of the U.S.
So the agents got to work. They started digging, interviewing informants, pulling arrest records and phone logs. Let's take a look at the portrait of Allen Ginsberg that they were putting together in those files. And just look at what they zeroed in on. They documented his, quote, bizarre activities, which included him openly calling for the legalization of marijuana. They made notes on his narcotic and sexual proclivities, his psychiatric history, and, using the language of the day, his self-admitted homosexuality. For the Bureau, this was the profile of a subversive. And yet, after all those years of surveillance, here's the big official conclusion. They decided that his actions, while, quote, extremely eccentric, didn't make him dangerous enough for the security index, which was basically a list of people who'd be arrested if martial law was ever declared. The threat, it turns out, wasn't what they thought. Okay, but this is where the story takes a huge turn. The government saw an extremely eccentric public figure, but if you actually look at the themes in his poetry, guilt, death, remembrance, you find a totally different person. The public file tells one story, but his personal work, that tells another, much, much deeper one. To really get who this man was, behind the file, we have to look past the surveillance reports and go right to the source of his deepest pain and his greatest art. And that all comes down to his mother, a story he poured into his epic poem, Kaddish. See, this is the guy the FBI was tracking, but he was also a son who was trying to process a lifetime of trauma and love. That public firebrand everyone saw was being fueled by a really private, really immense grief.
Kaddish, which came out in 1961, is really his masterpiece of personal grief. The full title says it all. Kaddish for Naomi Ginsberg. It's this raw, powerful reckoning with her life, her death, and all of his own feelings of guilt and remembrance wrapped up in it. Now that title, Kaddish, is so important. A Kaddish is a Jewish prayer for the dead. It's about remembering and honoring someone. Ginsberg wrote this poem partly because a formal Kaddish prayer was never actually said at his mother's funeral. So, this was his version.
And the reason for all this deep, complicated grief was his mother's incredibly tragic life. Naomi Ginsberg had schizophrenia and suffered from these severe paranoid delusions. She spent years, much of Allen's childhood, in and out of mental institutions. It was a painful experience that would just shape his entire life and his work.
This might be the most haunting detail of the whole story. 2 days after his mother passed away, Ginsberg got her last letter, and it just had this one unforgettable line, a message of hope or madness sent from beyond the grave. This single sentence became a huge inspiration for the poem.
Okay, so we have the public threat and the private pain. But there's a third piece to this whole puzzle, the poetic power. Ginsberg's revolutionary style, it didn't just pop out of nowhere. He inherited it. His main spiritual and stylistic guide was another giant of American poetry, another radical voice from a century before him, Walt Whitman. And the connection between these two is it's unmistakable.
I mean, you can see it right here. On the left is Whitman's Song of Myself, on the right Ginsberg's How.
You don't have to be a poetry expert to hear it, to feel that shared DNA. The long, tumbling lines, that rhythmic repetition, the way they both just list out all these details of American life. It's the same exact energy, just 100 years apart.
Ginsberg was plugging into this very American tradition, the tradition of breaking tradition. Both poets used free verse, they threw out the old rules of rhyme and meter, they built their poems on these long lines that were structured around the rhythm of a single human breath, and they used these huge lists and catalogs to paint their big, sweeping pictures.
And this inheritance wasn't just about style, it was a direct challenge to that idea of good order. Whitman's incredible courage to write about love between men back in the 19th century, that created the space for Ginsberg to write about his own homosexuality with a kind of raw, confrontational honesty that was just shocking for the 1950s. Whitman basically opened a door that Ginsberg would come along and blow right off its hinges.
So when you start to put all these pieces together, the political, the personal, and the poetic, you finally start to see the full picture of Allen Ginsberg.
This is really how an icon like him was made. You start with a man whose life was so different, so unconventional, that the establishment saw him as a threat. Then you find that his life was shaped by this almost unbearable private pain. And he was able to channel all of that into his art because he had this powerful poetic tradition to draw on, one that gave him the tools to say what he needed to say.
And that leaves us with one final thought. The government saw a threat, but Ginsberg's story, it shows us something completely different. It shows us the explosive, world-changing power that gets unleashed when our most private, most painful experiences finally find a public voice.